The marble hallways of the Capitol building carried a distinct chill on that late February Tuesday. Inside the chamber of the House of Representatives, the lighting was flat, institutional, and entirely unforgiving. It was the kind of illumination that left every movement, every gesture, and every subtle shift in posture completely exposed to the galleries above. The Government Reform and Accountability Act had been dominating the floor proceedings for 6 consecutive hours. In the Speaker's chair, slightly elevated above the well of the House, sat the presiding officer. He wore a standard navy suit with a white shirt and a burgundy tie. There was no pocket square. His reading glasses rested on the bridge of his nose. He held a blue pen, methodically reviewing legislative amendments on a digital tablet, occasionally pausing to ink a note onto a printed margin. His demeanor was entirely functional. He possessed the quiet consistency of a man accustomed to arriving early, analyzing documents in silence and avoiding the spotlight. Beneath that unremarkable exterior was a seasoned constitutional lawyer. He was a professional who had built a career handling complex state Supreme Court arguments and parsing through intricate federal rules of evidence. He did not traffic in volume or theatrical gestures. His chosen instrument was precision. Across the chamber, the representative from California rose from his seat on the Democratic side. He had spent the afternoon engaged in quiet conversations with his staff, checking his phone and observing the floor debates. Now he adjusted his jacket and walked deliberately toward the lowest point in the room. He positioned himself in the well, standing directly below the elevated speaker's chair, and requested formal recognition. The presiding officer paused his pen, looked up through his lenses, and offered a slight nod. The floor was yielded. The California representative did not address the pending legislation. He planted his feet firmly, fixed his gaze upward at the chair, and launched a calculated offensive. His voice carried the smooth, rehearsed cadence of a seasoned television regular. He announced that he was rising to address a fundamental crisis of leadership. A distinct murmur moved through the aisles. Behind the rail, staff members subtly angled their mobile devices, ensuring the cameras were positioned to capture the moment. It was a highly coordinated effort. The representative's voice echoed through the chamber, declaring the man in the chair to be a severe risk to the institution. He paused, allowing the silence to stretch, ensuring the broadcast feeds had time to split the screen between the accuser and the accused. He stated that the presiding officer was not a leader, but rather a passive instrument of a former administration, functioning merely as a rubber stamp wielding a gavel. He accused the chair of attempting to invalidate millions of legally cast votes and dismantling the integrity of the electoral process. The rhetoric was constructed with meticulous care. Every clause escalated into the next, building a rhythm perfected across hundreds of network television appearances. He labeled the presiding officer a constitutional arsonist cloaked in polite manners, accusing him of disguising extreme ideologies behind a kind smile. He extended his arm, pointing his index finger directly at the elevated chair in a dramatic prosecutorial gesture. He declared that the institution was being quietly destroyed. Applause erupted from his side of the aisle. Several members stood to their feet. The sound of deliberate, rhythmic clapping echoed near the back rows. Throughout the entire sequence, the man in the speaker's chair did not react. He remained perfectly still. His hands were calmly folded on the desk. He observed the spectacle with the detached patience of someone waiting for a change in the weather. He had spent his career cross-examining hostile witnesses and absorbing pressure. He understood intimately that the most vulnerable position a person can take is to respond to every provocation with visible emotion. The chamber eventually settled. The room waited. Then the presiding officer executed a movement he rarely employed. He stood up, he removed his reading glasses, folded the earpieces with deliberate slowness, and placed them precisely next to the wooden gavel. He leaned slightly toward the microphone. His voice was entirely level, devoid of any shouting, yet carrying a functional gravity that commanded absolute attention. He announced that the chair would exercise its right of response. The galleries went entirely silent. He looked down into the well and thanked the representative. He stated that the gratitude was sincere, noting that using the public's time to deliver a highly personal attack made the forthcoming conversation strictly necessary. Reaching beneath the heavy wooden desk, the speaker withdrew a large three-ring binder. It was navy blue, its spine cracked from years of heavy use. The edges were overflowing with yellow and pink sticky notes. Dense, handwritten annotations covered the margins of the visible pages. It was not a political prop, it was a working legal file. He held the binder up, asking the representative if he recognized the document. The representative's hand, which had been gesturing expansively moments before, slowly dropped to his side. The speaker identified the binder as his personal copy of the impeachment record. He reminded the room that he had served on the defense counsel. He had sat mere feet away from the representative during those proceedings, reading every exhibit, tracking every assertion, and analyzing the presentation of evidence. He opened the heavy cover. The pages inside were heavily highlighted in green and yellow. Looking directly at the man in the well, the speaker stated that he had witnessed a professional conduct he had never seen in 2 decades of legal practice. He noted that evidence known to be incomplete was presented as comprehensive, utilizing classified barriers to prevent immediate contradiction. He turned to a specific tabbed section. He cited the precise number of times the representative had appeared on national television during the respective investigation, 423 times. He read directly from the transcripts, noting the repeated claims of significant and damning evidence. He then methodically listed the outcomes of 3 separate, independent investigations led by career professionals. None of them supported the claims broadcasted to the public. The representative in the well shifted his weight. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium. His facial expression remained controlled, a byproduct of years of media training, but a visible tension settled around his eyes. The speaker turned another page, moving to the second point of contention. He recalled a specific committee hearing from September 2019. He described how the representative had read a fabricated dialogue into the official congressional record, presenting it as the substance of a call between heads of state. When pressed by journalists later, the representative had dismissed the fabrication as a simple parody. The speaker's delivery remained surgical. He reminded the chamber that the congressional record serves as the permanent legal foundation of the nation's legislative history. It is referenced by federal courts to determine legislative intent. He stated clearly that there is no parody exception to truth in official government proceedings. He noted that inserting fiction into these permanent archives compromises the legal framework of the republic. He read a handwritten note from the margin of his binder, dated 6 years prior, documenting the exact moment the record was compromised. He closed that section and placed his hands flat on the desk, his posture shifting from passive observation to active evidentiary presentation. The presiding officer adjusted his posture, shifting his weight slightly forward in the elevated chair. He moved past the initial evidence, turning to a newly tabbed section of the heavily annotated binder. The third point of order concerned classified intelligence. The mere mention of the term visibly altered the atmosphere in the room. In the nation's capital, classified information is not an abstract political concept. It represents immediate, tangible operational risks. He addressed the representative's former role overseeing the Intelligence Committee, detailing the nature of a sensitive compartmented information facility. He did not use metaphors. He described the physical reality of the space, a secure room devoid of windows, shielded extensively against electronic signal leakage, where all communication devices are strictly surrendered at the threshold. Inside those reinforced walls, intelligence professionals deliver briefings on networks that require decades of careful cultivation. The speaker noted, his voice dropping into a register of cold, absolute certainty, that unauthorized disclosures from these environments carry the severe risk of compromising field operations and causing the permanent, irreversible loss of human assets in hostile territories. Replacing his reading glasses, the Speaker opened a red-tabbed section of his file. He stated that an administrative review of access logs and temporal data had yielded a highly specific correlation analysis. He ran his index finger down a printed spreadsheet. On 12 documented occasions over a 26-month period, there was a precise metadata correlation. The pattern was structural. The representative would attend a secure morning briefing, and within 48 hours, a national media outlet would publish a report containing highly specific operational details that matched the exact content of that closed-door session. The Speaker looked up from the data. He clarified, maintaining the measured tone of a legal practitioner, that he was not leveling a formal prosecution. Instead, he was placing on the public record that the complete metadata set had been formally referred to federal counterintelligence divisions for ongoing assessment. A distinct, sharper sound swept through the legislative floor. It was the collective realization that this was no longer rhetorical debate. It was the announcement of an active federal referral. Behind the wooden rail, the representative's chief of staff abruptly stood up. He gripped his mobile device with both hands, his thumbs frozen over the illuminated screen, paralyzed by the sudden shift in institutional gravity. The Speaker lowered his voice further, noting the stark irony. The same individual who had utilized hundreds of broadcast hours to accuse others of foreign compromise, who had looked into camera lenses to claim absolute proof of illicit external influence, was now linked to a data pattern heavily consistent with unauthorized intelligence disclosures. Down in the well of the House, the representative's facial expression froze. The practiced composure of a television veteran fractured into absolute stillness. His knuckles, gripping the edges of the wooden podium, turned visibly pale against the dark mahogany. He opened his mouth, the automatic instinct of a man who had successfully navigated 2 decades of public scrutiny through sheer eloquence. Yet the vocal machinery simply failed to engage. For the first time in his documented public career, he encountered a sequential dismantling of his record that his language center could not process fast enough to counter. He stood in complete silence. In the galleries above, the faint clicks of mobile phone cameras began to echo. The Speaker then closed the binder. He reached across the desk and retrieved a single, unattached sheet of paper. It was not a legal brief or a committee transcript. It was a standard financial disclosure form. When he spoke next, the acoustics of his voice shifted. The courtroom edge dissolved, replaced by the somber, restrained cadence of a solemn gathering. He introduced the 4th issue as a fundamental matter of human conscience. He cited a specific campaign contribution of $2,700. He read the name of the donor aloud. The introduction of that specific name landed differently than the prior legal arguments. The previous evidence was institutional. This was profoundly human. The Speaker read from the public record. He noted that the named donor had recently been convicted on severe federal charges, including the illicit distribution of regulated substances resulting in fatal overdoses. 2 individuals, Gemmel Moore and Timothy Dean, lost their lives inside the donor's residence. The legal system had issued a lengthy federal prison sentence. Holding the financial document by its edges, the Speaker focused entirely on the timeline. The first tragedy occurred in July of 2017. The second took place in January of 2019. Throughout the duration of both events, the representative's campaign account retained the financial contribution. The silence within the chamber evolved from political anticipation into profound human discomfort. It was the quiet of a room collectively unable to look away from a tragic ledger. The Speaker kept his hand resting lightly on the printed form. He spoke of redemption and grace, stating that moving forward requires the basic courage to acknowledge errors and prioritize moral conscience over financial convenience. He referenced the younger victim, a 26-year-old who had maintained a personal journal documenting his harrowing experiences before his passing in that specific residence. Between that first loss and the subsequent loss of a 55-year-old man in the exact same location, the campaign funds remained untouched. Looking down at the well, the speaker's expression held no political triumph, only a quiet, unperformable sadness. He stated that in over 400 television appearances across multiple years of intensive media coverage, the representative had never publicly spoken the names of the victims. He had never issued a statement of acknowledgement. The funds were held while families buried their sons, and the silence was maintained. The representative's eyes darted toward the gallery, then toward the exits. The internal calculation was visible, the desperate search for a strategic pivot or a standard public relations reframe, but his lips only moved silently. There was no viable political talking point for the documented timeline of a tragedy. There was no rhetorical escape route from the ink of a victim's journal. The presiding officer placed the financial disclosure form aside. He opened his heavily annotated binder for the final time. He stated that he did not need to reference his notes for the fifth point of order, as he had been seated in the presiding chair when the event occurred. His voice shifted into a measured, deeply clinical register, resembling a magistrate reading a formal sentence. He cited the date, June 21st, 2023. He reminded the chamber that on that specific afternoon, the House had voted 213 to 209 to issue a formal censure against the representative. The resolution explicitly charged him with broadcasting misleading information to the American public regarding the fundamental nature of federal intelligence evidence. The Speaker paused, allowing the structural symmetry of the moment to register. He noted that he had held the gavel while those charges were read aloud to the very same representative, standing in the exact same location in the well of the House. He leaned forward, clarifying the administrative weight of the action. He stated that a formal censure is not a minor procedural penalty. It represents the ultimate institutional judgment by the elected representatives of the nation. It signifies that a member has fundamentally violated the public trust. It is permanently entered into the historical archives. It is the closest equivalent to a formal conviction that the legislative branch can issue without initiating criminal proceedings. He locked eyes with the representative below. He emphasized the number, 213 individuals. These were not network television pundits compensated to deliver opinions. These were not anonymous digital commentators. These were his direct peers, individuals who shared the same committee rooms and rode the same legislative elevators. They had reviewed the evidentiary record of his conduct and concluded that he had actively misled the nation. He noted that even members of the representative's own political conference had chosen to abstain or physically leave the chamber rather than mount a defense. Down in the well, the representative's right hand exhibited a visible tremor. This was not the rehearsed, theatrical distress of a television performance. It was a genuine, involuntary, mechanical failure. A hand that had spent 2 decades gesturing with practiced precision toward camera lenses was now vibrating uncontrollably under the flat, unforgiving lighting of the chamber. Aware that his physical reactions were being monitored by the galleries, he pulled his hand rapidly from the wooden podium, pressing his palm flat against his thigh to trap the movement. The chamber was suspended in absolute silence. From the upper gallery, the faint mechanical click of a mobile phone shutter echoed across the room. The speaker slowly retrieved the wooden gavel. He did not raise it in a threatening posture. He held it horizontally across his palm, evaluating the wood as a carpenter might evaluate a functional tool. His voice remained remarkably steady. He addressed the representative directly, recalling the accusations made only moments prior, that the chair was weak, that the chair was a rubber stamp. He rotated the gavel slightly, allowing the polished wood to catch the institutional light. He provided a brief lineage of the instrument. He noted it had been held by predecessors who navigated global conflicts, who brokered monumental domestic reforms with ideological opponents, and who wielded it with aggressive political force. He stated that his approach was fundamentally different. He held the instrument exactly as a judge holds it, not as a weapon of political retribution, but as an absolute responsibility. A responsibility to maintain procedural order, to protect the integrity of the institution, and to ensure that when a member utilizes the floor, their statements are grounded in verifiable truth. He set the gavel down gently on the elevated desk. He stated with chilling clarity that the representative was the precise reason the institution required a gavel. Without an authority willing to hold the line, individuals would continually transform the legislative floor into a broadcast stage, convert the permanent congressional record into fictional narratives, and treat severe operational intelligence breaches as standard press leaks. The Speaker straightened his tie, replaced his reading glasses, and picked up the gavel one final time. He listed the violations in rapid succession: the fabricated presidential dialogue, the 423 broadcasts contradicting independent federal investigations, the retention of campaign funds tied to documented fatalities. He looked down at the well. The physical geometry of the chamber was absolute. The authority of the chair positioned above, the subject positioned below. "You are out of order right now," the Speaker declared. He brought the gavel down. One single strike. It was not theatrical. It was a measured, constitutional sound, the heavy impact of wood on wood that had echoed within those walls for over 2 centuries. He announced that the House would come to order. The explosion of reaction was not immediate. There was a full, singular second of absolute silence as the entire room processed the terminal finality of the strike. Then, the right side of the aisle erupted. It was not mere applause, it was a deeper, visceral release. Members stood at their desks, pointing toward the elevated chair with expressions of long-awaited vindication. In the well, the representative remained completely silent. A man who had built an entire career upon the strategic principle that silence equals defeat on television. A man who consistently ensured he delivered the final narrative framing, produced absolutely no sound. His mouth remained slightly parted. His eyes were fixated not directly on the Speaker, but on the small wooden object resting on the desk like a closed book. Behind the rail, his chief of staff was making frantic, subtle gestures, attempting to beckon him back to the safety of the aisles. The representative did not move. He possessed no remaining words. Every rhetorical weapon he had ever deployed, moral indignation, eloquence, higher principles, had been methodically dismantled using his own documented history. There is no viable cross-examination against one's own financial disclosures. There is no rebuttal to an institutional censure. He turned and walked slowly back to his seat. By late afternoon, the digital ecosystem was entirely saturated. The uninterrupted 12-minute exchange bypassed standard news cycles, accumulating millions of views within hours. Cable networks fragmented their coverage along predictable ideological fault lines, but the visual reality remained unaltered. The representative's office released a brief 4-sentence statement that evening. It categorized the event as a political distraction. It explicitly avoided mentioning the intelligence metadata, the fabricated transcripts, or the campaign funds. In political communications, extreme brevity following a massive public exposure serves as an implicit confession of strategic paralysis. It signaled that the communications team had recognized an impossible defensive position. The institutional reverberations extended far beyond the Capitol. Independent federal analysts noted that the intelligence correlation data presented on the floor mirrored the exact parameters utilized in severe security clearance reviews. The families of the 2 victims, long marginalized in broader political discourse, saw their loved ones' names independently trending across major platforms. The following morning, the representative altered his established routines. He arrived at his office significantly earlier than usual, avoiding the standard hallway cameras, moving with the rapid, lowered posture of a man navigating hostile territory. Conversely, the presiding officer held his standard weekly press conference. He offered no celebratory remarks. When pressed by the media regarding the exchange, he simply adjusted his glasses, a habitual stabilizing gesture, and stated that the necessary facts had been entered into the record and the House had returned to its legislative duties. 1,000 miles away, in a quiet living room in Louisiana, an older man watched the broadcast replay. He did not focus on the complex legislative maneuvering. He focused on the steady grip on the gavel, the measured tone of the voice, and the absolute absence of panic. He sent a brief text message to the speaker's father, a retired firefighter bearing permanent physical scars. The response he received was equally brief. He held the line. At a regional law school, a senior professor of constitutional law paused her scheduled seminar to project the raw footage onto the classroom screen. As the video concluded, she looked across her silent students. She explained that true legal authority does not exist solely within theoretical frameworks or academic journals. It exists in practice, executed by individuals willing to carry the immense weight of the documentation. She noted that the current Speaker of the House had once sat in their exact classroom rows. He had not been the loudest student, nor the most aggressively visible. He had simply been the most prepared. The Constitution she imparted to the future attorneys is not merely a document to be passively studied. It is an instrument meant to be carried in a worn binder, carefully annotated, patiently waiting for the precise moment when the institution desperately needs to be reminded of what it actually says. While the physical confrontation had formally concluded on the marble floor of the House, the digital and institutional shockwaves were only just beginning to fracture the Capitol's ecosystem. The timeline of the immediate aftermath revealed the total collapse of a carefully constructed political shield. The digital timestamp on the initial uploaded clip read exactly 4:47 in the afternoon, Eastern Standard Time. It was posted simultaneously by 3 different congressional press accounts. Within the highly insulated operations of Washington, a timeline of less than 3 hours is typically required to construct a defensive narrative. On this particular Tuesday, however, the traditional machinery of crisis management completely seized. By 5:15, the exact phrase, "the House will come to order," was multiplying across every major demographic tracking algorithm. By 6 o'clock, the uninterrupted 12-minute exchange had been viewed 8 million times on a single platform. Cable networks immediately fractured their coverage along predictable ideological fault lines, but the visual reality of the broadcast remained fundamentally unaltered. One conservative network led with a graphic declaring the speaker had eviscerated his opponent. A competing liberal network attempted to frame the event as a weaponization of the presiding chair. Yet, the most telling reaction occurred on a strictly centrist broadcast. An anchor known for hosting the California representative more frequently than any other journalist in cable news history stared directly at the studio monitor. The network played the entire clip without interruption, twice. The anchor bypassed standard defensive pivots, offering only a stark, unscripted observation. It was a sequence of events previously unseen. Simultaneously, the highest echelons of the constitutional law community responded with unprecedented speed. A prominent legal scholar from Harvard posted a grudging acknowledgement, confirming that the Speaker's characterization of the congressional record's legal significance was technically and precisely accurate. A counterpart at Georgetown labeled it the most effective use of institutional authority from the Speaker's chair in recent memory, noting specifically that the weapon of choice was cited case law rather than political theater. Inside the representatives' leadership suites, the atmosphere was completely devoid of its usual manic energy. There was no shouting. The crisis was strictly mechanical. At exactly 7:30 in the evening, his office released a formal public statement. It was exactly 4 sentences long. It categorized the Speaker's remarks as a political distraction designed to obscure legislative agendas. In the realm of political communications, extreme brevity following a massive public exposure serves as an implicit confession of strategic paralysis. The statement did not address the intelligence metadata correlations. It did not mention the fabricated congressional transcripts. It explicitly avoided any reference to the fatal overdoses tied to the campaign funds. It signaled to the entire press corps that the communications team had drafted multiple variations and recognized that every single detailed response opened a legal door they could not close. By 8 o'clock, the broader political apparatus began to physically distance itself. The digital servers at Politico received an urgent background briefing. 3 independent Democratic strategists requested absolute anonymity to deliver a cold autopsy of the event. One former leadership aide, a veteran of the first impeachment proceedings, stated plainly that the representative had made a catastrophic tactical error. He had chosen to attack the singular individual in the building who had physically lived the evidentiary record. You cannot, the strategist noted bluntly, spin your own documented history. As the evening progressed, the crisis transcended standard political damage control, bleeding into the far more severe realm of national security. During primetime broadcast, the focus shifted entirely to the third article of the speaker's presentation. 3 former intelligence officials appeared across different networks. The lower third of a major broadcast displayed the phrase metadata correlation. A former Central Intelligence officer did not engage in political theater. He possessed the clinical, exhausted demeanor of a man who had spent decades managing covert human assets. He bypassed the political implications entirely, confirming that cross-referencing specific facility attendance logs with the precise publication times of unauthorized media disclosures was the exact analytical methodology utilized by federal bureaus. He stated clearly that if the presented data set was accurate, the situation had ceased to be a political complication. It was now an active, severe legal hazard. As midnight approached, the digital landscape shifted a final time. The political algorithms were entirely eclipsed by a sudden surge in human curiosity. Millions of individuals began initiating. Gemel Moore and Timothy Dean were no longer relegated to obscure footnotes in federal court documents. The profound human silence that the speaker had weaponized on the floor was now echoing across the nation. The families of the 2 victims, who had been largely invisible in the political conversation for years, were suddenly thrust into the absolute center of the public consciousness. The mother of the younger victim logged into her social media account for the first time in 2 years. She did not write a lengthy manifesto. She did not draft a political attack. She simply uploaded a digitized photograph of her son as a child. There was no caption. There was no commentary. The image itself carried the devastating weight of the speaker's floor argument. Within hours, the silent photograph was shared over 400,000 times. It was a digital manifestation of the exact human consequence that the political class had spent years attempting to ignore. The gavel strike had not just concluded a debate, it had initiated a profound, irreversible reckoning. By dawn the following morning, the physical reality of the Capitol had fundamentally shifted. The architectural grandeur of the legislative buildings remained unchanged, but the operational maneuvers of its inhabitants had drastically altered. The representative from California officially canceled 2 scheduled morning media appearances. His press secretary issued a standard procedural notice, citing sudden scheduling conflicts. However, the internal security cameras in the Senate office buildings recorded a different narrative. At exactly 7:15 in the morning, a full hour earlier than his established routine, the representative arrived at his suite. He entered alone and firmly closed the heavy wooden door. He did not emerge for scheduled floor votes until late in the afternoon. When he finally appeared in the public corridors, his physical cadence was unrecognizable. A man who had spent a career deliberately pausing for hallway press gaggles now moved with a rapid, defensive gait. His head was lowered, his shoulders were drawn inward. It was the distinct posture of an individual navigating an open field under direct hostile observation. Near the cloakroom, a junior colleague from the Midwest stepped forward, attempting to initiate a standard greeting. The representative walked past him without a single gesture of acknowledgement. Conversely, the presiding officer of the House maintained his exact weekly schedule. He arrived at the designated briefing room for his regular Tuesday press conference. He stood behind the podium, holding his notes, and directed the discussion strictly toward the details of the pending Government Reform Act. He did not engage in a victory lap. He offered no unprompted statements regarding the previous day's events. When a senior political correspondent inevitably shifted the topic, pressing the speaker on whether he believed the representative should formally resign, the room fell quiet. The speaker did not raise his voice. He executed a habitual, almost unconscious gesture, pushing his reading glasses slightly up the bridge of his nose. It was a mechanical movement that purchased a half-second of calculation while appearing entirely natural. He looked directly at the press pool. He stated in a completely level tone that the matter was now strictly between the representative, his voting constituents, and his own conscience. He then picked up his heavily annotated blue binder. He tucked it securely under his arm, a specific utilitarian carry, and walked back to his legislative office. 1,000 miles away, in Bossier City, Louisiana, the national broadcast played out in a living room that had not been redecorated since the mid-90s. An older man named Randy sat in a worn recliner. The television volume was set exceptionally high. His hearing had never fully recovered from a severe occupational accident at Fire Station 4 decades earlier. It was the same industrial accident that had permanently disabled his closest friend, Gary, the father of the current Speaker of the House. Randy watched the broadcasted clip of the floor exchanged 3 separate times. The first time, he analyzed the procedural argument. The second time, he observed the physical mechanics. He noted the precise manner in which the speaker held the wooden gavel. It mirrored the exact steady grip his father had utilized when holding heavy emergency equipment, deliberate, purposeful, with absolutely no wasted movement. He observed the strict emotional regulation in the speaker's voice, recognizing the same operational calm required to instruct new recruits on navigating a burning structure. Panic in their shared background was a fatal luxury. The third time he watched the footage, he understood the silent cost of that composure. He knew that the speaker had learned the architecture of quiet authority from a father who had survived a catastrophic structural collapse and who had subsequently lived a life of profound, uncomplaining endurance. Randy picked up his mobile phone. He did not call the speaker. Instead, he drafted a text message to the speaker's father, a retired man who still attended rigorous physical rehabilitation twice a week. He typed 3 words, "Your boy's good." 2 minutes later, the digital reply illuminated the screen. He held the line. Randy placed the phone on the side table, turned off the television monitor, and walked toward his kitchen. He poured a glass of sweet tea with the slow, methodical rhythm of a man who understood that steady hands are ultimately more valuable than the loudest voices in the room. Simultaneously, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the academic environment of a university law center intersected with the reality of the congressional floor. A senior professor was halfway through a complex lecture on the historical precedents of judicial review when the synchronized buzzing of mobile devices disrupted the seminar. A second-year student, a recent moot court champion slated for a federal clerkship, raised his hand. He informed the professor that the Speaker of the House had just utilized specific administrative law frameworks to officially declare a contamination of the legislative record. The professor, a veteran educator who had taught constitutional law at the institution since the late 1990s, walked to the digital podium. She pulled up the raw 12-minute feed and projected it onto the primary lecture screen. The room of future attorneys watched the exchange in absolute, unbroken silence. When the video concluded, the professor disabled the projector. The flat light of the classroom returned. She looked across the rows of desks. She stated, her voice carrying the weight of a definitive closing argument, that what they had just witnessed was the precise application of constitutional law. It was not a theoretical paper, nor a simulated court exercise, nor an obscure academic review. It was the active, high-stakes deployment of institutional authority on the floor of the United States Congress. She paused, pointing toward the fourth row of the lecture hall. She informed the students that the current speaker had once occupied that exact seat. She noted that he had never been the loudest voice in the room. He had simply been the most thoroughly prepared individual every single day. When a student asked if the speaker's legal argument regarding the permanent contamination of the historical archives was technically sound, the professor offered a rare, genuine smile. She assigned the question as their final examination topic. The room of aspiring lawyers absorbed a lesson that no standard textbook could effectively convey. The governing framework of the nation is not merely a static historical document. It is a functional, heavy instrument. It is meant to be carried in a dog-eared binder, heavily annotated, and patiently maintained for years, waiting specifically for the singular moment when the institution desperately needs to be reminded of its own rules. He carried it, and when the structural integrity of the room required it, he opened it. 72 hours after the strike of the wooden gavel, the institutional machinery of Washington began to process the fallout. It did not happen on television. It happened in secure rooms through the slow, irreversible movement of federal documentation. 2 miles from the Capitol building, inside the climate-controlled subterranean corridors of the National Archives, the official stenographic record of the Tuesday floor session was formally submitted for permanent preservation. The process was entirely mechanical. The pages were verified, scanned, cataloged, and sealed into the National Repository. The representative's previous fabricated dialogue, the entry he had once read into the microphone and later defended to the press corps as a mere parody, now sat in the identical archival system alongside the official bipartisan censure and the speaker's meticulous dismantling of his credibility. The historical record had corrected itself. It was no longer a matter of competing political narratives broadcasted over cable news networks. It was physical ink on acid-free paper, securely vaulted for future judicial reviews and historical reference. Across the Potomac River, within the heavily fortified perimeter of the Federal Bureau of Investigation headquarters, the Counterintelligence Division operated entirely within the negative space of the news cycle. There were no dramatic press conferences. There were no public briefings or anonymous leaks to favor journalists. There was only the methodical, silent extraction of data. Inside a highly secure, windowless analytical center, federal technicians initiated a formal review of the metadata correlation provided by the Speaker's office. They did not analyze political rhetoric, tone, or intention. They analyzed raw, unforgiving mathematics. On one secure monitor, analysts pulled the highly classified access logs from the House intelligence facilities, detailing the exact entry and exit timestamps of the representative. On an adjacent monitor, they cross-referenced those times against the digital publication timestamps of unauthorized national security disclosures by major media outlets. The digital footprint was sterile, objective, and completely immune to public relations spin. They mapped the precise temporal overlap between closed-door, classified briefings and external media leaks. When a specific data pattern emerges 12 distinct times within a 26-month operational window, federal protocols dictate that it is no longer treated as a statistical anomaly. It is formally classified as an active structural vulnerability. The machinery of a federal probe had been quietly engaged. Simultaneously, the financial architecture of the representative's campaign was subjected to intense, microscopic scrutiny. The specific ledger entry, the $2,700 contribution, directly linked to the fatal tragedies in the donor's West Hollywood residence, had transitioned from an obscure accounting detail into a highly visible, toxic liability. In a private legal office blocks away from the Capitol, a senior campaign finance attorney reviewed the ledger. The strategic trap engineered by the Speaker's floor presentation was absolute. If the representative's campaign suddenly returned the funds after years of holding them, it would be universally interpreted as a delayed admission of guilt, driven strictly by public exposure. If they continued to hold the funds, the daily media cycle would continuously resurface the names of the two victims. There was no viable communication strategy to sanitize the timeline. The profound silence the representative had maintained while holding those funds was now compounding the institutional pressure hour by hour. Back on Capitol Hill, the physical environment of the House of Representatives began to reflect these invisible systemic shifts. The representative from California returned to the chamber for routine legislative votes later in the week, but the spatial dynamics around him had permanently altered. He was no longer the focal point of the center aisle. The subtle gravitational pull that seasoned television politicians exert over junior colleagues and ambitious staffers had evaporated. When he stood near the electronic voting terminals, a distinct physical perimeter formed around him. Colleagues engaged in quiet conversations naturally angled their shoulders away, avoiding direct eye contact. The rapid, constant exchange of legislative strategies and whispered hallway intelligence simply bypassed his immediate vicinity. He was experiencing the most severe terminal consequence the political ecosystem can inflict upon an elected official: total irrelevance. From the elevated vantage point of the Speaker's chair, the presiding officer observed the floor. He did not monitor the California representative with an expression of triumph or vindictiveness. He merely managed the legislative queue, signing continuing resolutions with his blue pen and formally recognizing committee chairs. His dog-eared, heavily annotated blue binder was positioned neatly on the corner of the heavy wooden desk. It was closed, but immediately accessible. The gavel rested exactly where it belonged. The House was finally in order. The performative era of the chamber had been decisively fractured, replaced entirely by the cold, unforgiving reality of the permanent record. By the second week following the floor exchange, a profound, invisible architectural shift had settled over the broader Capitol complex. The immediate crisis management had concluded, but the institutional reverberations were manifesting in quiet, unprecedented ways. Political scientists refer to it as a paradigm shift. In the physical corridors of Washington, it simply looked like caution. The most visible change occurred within the committee hearing rooms. For the better part of a decade, these chambers had functioned primarily as sound stages. Junior representatives routinely utilized their allotted 5 minutes of questioning not to extract information from witnesses, but to produce viral, easily clippable moments for digital fundraising. On a standard Thursday morning, the House Judiciary Committee convened. A second-term representative, known specifically for his fiery, pre-written monologues, was formally recognized by the chair. He adjusted his microphone. His communications director stood perfectly positioned behind the press barricade, mobile phone raised to capture the anticipated performance. The representative looked down at his prepared text. It was a document filled with aggressive characterizations and legally ambiguous accusations, the exact formula that had successfully built his national profile. He paused. He looked toward the central dais. He then physically set the prepared speech aside. Instead of delivering his rehearsed monologue, he opened a standard investigative file, referenced a specific page number, and asked a direct, entirely procedural question. Behind the barricade, his communications director slowly lowered the camera. This silent recalibration was repeating itself across multiple committees. The absolute dismantling of the California representative had successfully demonstrated a terrifying new vulnerability. The presiding officer had not utilized raw political leverage. He had utilized the permanent evidentiary record. He had proven that broadcast rhetoric could be weaponized against the Speaker if it deviated from documented reality. Consequently, the volume in the Capitol significantly decreased. Deep inside the executive office buildings, the daily operations of legislative press shops were completely overhauled. The rapid response communications teams, groups of young, highly aggressive operatives trained to draft inflammatory social media posts within seconds of a political development were suddenly subjected to multi-layered clearance protocols. In one prominent suite, a junior press secretary drafted a post accusing a rival coalition of illicit foreign coordination. A month prior, the draft would have been published instantly. Now, the chief of staff intervened. He did not evaluate the political messaging. He demanded to see the underlying source documentation. When the junior staffer admitted the claim was based on a cable news segment rather than a formal intelligence summary, the chief of staff deleted the draft. He pointedly reminded the room that national broadcasts do not provide legal immunity from the permanent congressional record. The media ecosystem, starved of its daily supply of manufactured outrage, was forced to adjust its operational model. Evening anchors found themselves lacking the standard incendiary sound bites. Instead, investigative journalists began submitting formal requests to the National Archives, actively pulling the historical transcripts of other highly vocal politicians. The press corps recognized that the speaker's methodology, cross-referencing television transcripts against independent federal reports, was a highly effective, infinitely replicable formula. A quiet panic spread among officials who had spent years trading in hyperbole. At the center of this systemic, chilling effect, the Speaker of the House remained remarkably invisible. He did not grant exclusive interviews to detail his strategic triumph. He did not authorize his senior staff to circulate anonymous congratulatory quotes in prominent political newsletters. His authority was no longer theoretical. It had been stress-tested on the floor, and it emerged absolute. He conducted his daily legislative meetings in the exact manner he always had. He sat at the head of the conference table, wearing his standard Navy suit, listening intently, and taking meticulous notes with a blue pen. Yet, the spatial dynamic within his office had fundamentally changed. When senior coalition leaders entered his suite to negotiate contentious budget allocations, they arrived differently. They no longer brought threats of holding out votes or utilizing media leverage. They brought detailed spreadsheets, independent financial analyses, and heavily annotated binders. They had learned, through the harsh public execution of a peer, that the man sitting behind the desk did not respond to volume. He responded to precision. The era of the performative politician had encountered a hard structural limit. The institution had forcefully self-corrected, shifting the balance of power away from the loudest voices in the broadcasting studios and returning it firmly to the quiet individuals who actually read the documents. Months after the strike of the gavel, the immediate friction of that February afternoon had been fully absorbed into the historical foundation of the Capitol. The rapid, relentless machinery of the Washington news cycle had inevitably moved forward, chasing new crises and manufacturing fresh outrage. Yet, the physical and institutional reality of the chamber remained permanently altered. To understand the true legacy of that 12-minute exchange, one must observe the House of Representatives not during the chaotic peak of legislative debate, but in the absolute stillness of the night. Long after the network cameras are powered down, after the galleries are emptied of tourists, and after the partisan operators have retreated to their respective suites, the architecture of the building asserts its own authority. The marble columns do not record television ratings. The mahogany desks do not track social media engagement. The physical space was meticulously designed by its founders to outlast the fleeting ambitions of any single occupant. For 2 decades, an illusion had been permitted to grow within those walls. It was the modern assumption that volume equates to power, that a carefully rehearsed soundbite holds more weight than a sworn testimony, and that the lens of a television camera is the ultimate judge of political survival. The representative from California had mastered this illusion. He had constructed an entire career upon the premise that reality is entirely malleable, provided you are the last person speaking on a national broadcast. But illusions, no matter how aggressively maintained, are fundamentally fragile. They require constant daily reinforcement. They shatter the moment they are forced into direct contact with the unforgiving permanence of the written record. The presiding officer had not defeated the representative with a louder voice. He had not outmaneuvered him with superior political theater. He had simply utilized the heavy, unyielding mechanics of the institution itself. He had taken the representative's fabricated dialogues, his broadcasted contradictions, and his documented financial retention, and formally bound them to his permanent historical profile. History does not remember the daily talking points of cable news anchors. History remembers the official censures. It remembers the counterintelligence metadata. It remembers the names of the victims finally spoken into the microphone and transcribed into the permanent archives. In his private office, the Speaker of the House did not mount the dog-eared navy blue binder in a glass display case. He did not frame the financial disclosure forms or the intelligence correlation data. He treated the materials with the exact same functional detachment his father had once applied to heavy emergency equipment. When the specific task was completed, the tools were simply returned to their proper place. The binder was placed back into his worn leather briefcase. The yellow and pink sticky notes remained protruding from the cracked spine, holding their positions. The legacy of that Tuesday is not merely a story of political retribution. It is a profound, structural reminder of what the framework of a republic actually requires to survive. The Constitution of the United States and the intricate parliamentary rules that govern its execution are not self-enforcing entities. They are not magical doctrines that automatically repel corruption or correct manufactured falsehoods. They are merely words printed on paper. They possess absolutely no power until an individual is willing to pick them up, study them with quiet, relentless precision, and deploy them at the exact moment the system threatens to tear itself apart. The institution does not require 100 loud men competing for the attention of a camera. It requires one quiet man willing to carry the documentation. Back on the floor of the House, the elevated chair sits empty in the dim overnight lighting. The digital voting terminals are dark, but resting precisely in the center of the heavy wooden desk is the gavel. It is a small, unadorned piece of wood. It carries no inherent political ideology. It simply waits for the morning, ready to be held by a steady hand, ready to demand that the truth be spoken, and ready to ensure that the House will inevitably come to order.